spanning 31 meters. The grand arches form a nave about 3 times wider than a typical Gothic cathedral. This is the most ambitious building project in the whole of the Byzantine Empire, and for one of its most demanding emperors.
What you've got is the archetypal, pain in the neck client. I mean, he happens to be a Roman emperor, and so is particularly likely to chop your head off if you get the job wrong.
But as they prepare to build the grand arches, Anthemius and Isidore may be unaware of the enormity of the task they have taken on. In order to erect these arches, they need to get their builders up to enormous heights. And to do this, they erect a wooden support known as a center on which the bricks and the mortar can be laid.
Effectively, it's a semicircular thing originally built using what looks like wheel technology, where you have an axle, which is the center of the arch, a series of radial spokes, and then a rim that goes around onto which you put all of your blocks of masonry.
The wooden formwork acts as a support for the concrete as it settles and hardens.
So the centering for the great arches and the centering for the dome itself would have been in themselves elaborate constructions of wooden supports.
This in itself is a major operation, as no center of this scale has ever been attempted before. One method of centering used by the Romans was the so-called flying center. This was a scaffold built into the fabric of the building itself, supported by joists wedged into the walls.
The issue with flying centering is that it spans from one side to the other. So it's like a giant beam in one sense, whereas if you're supporting off the floor, you can support it uniformly across the whole underside of the arch.
A flying center would have put much more pressure onto the piers supporting the arches, so it is unlikely that one was used in Hagia Sophia. Even so, the weight of the arches as they went up started pushing the piers out of shape. It would prove their great weakness, as the historian Procopius tells us. He describes an event that occurred during construction.
Unable to bear the mass that was pressing down upon them, the piers on top of which the arch was being built suddenly began to part asunder and seemed about to collapse.
Anthemius and Isidore had designed some of the piers to act like buttresses, absorbing the weight of the dome and the arches supporting it. But as the weight of the great arches pressed upon them, the weak points began to shear.
So they are settling under their own weight and creating tremendous pressure on the walls beneath them, which in turn are creating pressures on the columns holding those walls up.
If they didn't act quickly, the whole thing would split apart. You can still see the hasty solution they came up with in the fabric of the cathedral today.
By the time they actually got up to the gallery level and they started building in the brick arches for the vaults here, and they started work on the main arch for the dome, and that put tremendous pressure on the side piers. And so this pressure developed in such a way that they realized what they had to do was put in an extra buttress, which is what we have here.
Anthemius and Isidore ordered their builders to insert reinforcing arches within the existing buttress piers. It was too little, too late. While the lower part of the buttress piers were now firmly braced, the upper parts were buckling badly.
The weight of the superstructure is such that all of these arches have been pushed out of shape. None of them are any longer semicircular.
There was only one thing they could do. Reluctantly, Anthemius and Isidore increased the height of the pier, adding additional cross-bracing and filling in the uppermost arch to give it strength. But it still wasn't enough. In parts of the cathedral, you can still see today how the weight of the dome has tilted the columns outwards. Over time, if nothing was done, the dome could come crashing down. The answer to the problem can be found outside the cathedral. Jutting from the main supporting piers are a set of projections that were added in later centuries, when it became clear that the piers were still being pushed outwards. These were intended to deflect the outward thrust of the piers down into the ground. In effect, they acted like buttresses found in Gothic architecture. Such buttressing became the quick-fix answer to the recurring problem of the outward thrusting walls of Hagia Sophia. Buttresses were added as early as the 9th century, more in the 13th century, and possibly by the Ottoman Turks after 1453. But the damage had been done. The outward thrust of the walls now meant the base on which the dome would sit was no longer square.
You have to expect cracking and warping. It happens all the time. It's perfectly natural. And masonry buildings are able to absorb a great deal of cracking and warping. On the other hand, you have to pay very close attention to these deformations, because if they do get out of hand, then they will create a tipping point which could bring the whole building down.
When they first designed it, Anthemius and Isidore had planned to place a perfect hemispherical dome on top of these great arches. This was the optimum design for such a structure, minimizing the lateral thrusts on the piers and maintaining a constant, even pressure across the whole construction. Now, because the base was no longer square, a perfect circle was impossible. Their only feasible course of action was to build an elliptical dome with a shallower curve that could span the uneven dimensions. This sat on top of a cylinder, which allowed light to flood into the dome. It was a design that was dangerously unstable.
The downside of that is that the edge forces that you get out of a dome are related to its height and its span, and the shallower it is, the more it pushes out. So by making a shallower dome, it's quite likely that they increased all of the horizontal thrusts up at the roof level, all of which we know were already causing them problems anyway.
But there was little choice. More than 4 years had passed since construction had started. The Emperor Justinian was impatient to get into his new cathedral. Anthemius had died in 534. Now Isidore had to come up with an answer on his own before everything they had worked for collapsed around his ears. With the emperor breathing down his neck, he bows to the inevitable and instructs his engineers to build a much weaker elliptical dome, now on top of a cylinder. It is a botched job that will come back to haunt him. With the dome in place, Isidore the Elder could now turn his attention to decorating the cathedral. The interior of Hagia Sophia is truly beautiful. Its walls and floors are covered in marble. The tops of its pillars are delicately carved. And all over the building, magnificent mosaics glitter with gold.
Once you're inside, it's impossible to understand the architectural organization of the space, because you have so many intersecting and overlapping layers of light coming in from windows, of reflected light on marble and in mosaics, and of walls that don't appear as walls, but appear as screens of columns.
But the interior of Justinian's original cathedral would have looked much simpler than it does today.
The interior of Hagia Sophia is very different from the interior in Justinian's time in many different ways. There are a number of mosaics that have been added over the centuries. The imperial portraits, images of the imperial family, images of Christ and different emperors. And those have been added since Justinian's day.
Instead of showing portraits, most of the mosaics would have been simple crosses on a field of gold. The primary reason for this was a religious one.
In Byzantium, images were really problematic, because it was not clear what the relationship between an image and the holy figure that it depicted was. And so a lot of people tried to avoid this particular problem by not having any images of holy figures whatsoever. Justinian, either out of personal belief or out of political diplomacy, probably avoided the inclusion of holy figures in the building as a way of controlling the problematic nature of images.
But there is also a very practical reason behind this simple decoration. The simpler the decoration, the faster it gets completed. And Justinian wanted his cathedral completed in record time. Look closely at some of the marble fittings, and there is evidence that they have been hastily fitted together. The decoration of Hagia Sophia is a rush job. But nothing would be allowed to spoil the celebrations when it opened. On the 27th of December, 537, almost 6 years after construction started, the Emperor Justinian entered his new cathedral at the head of a magnificent procession.
Well, a building like this, the size of this, the scale and its beauty, is something that nobody had ever seen before. And in fact, according to accounts, when Justinian first came in here himself, he's supposed to have said, "Glory be to God for allowing me to complete this work. O Solomon, I have outdone thee."
Yet even as he uttered these words, Justinian himself was painfully aware of the precarious nature of his monument. The weight of the building was so great that it was causing the tops of the marble columns to flake. Yet no one truly realized just how dangerously precarious the building really was.